Welcome to Language Access Matters, the podcast that dives deep into the crucial role of language access in public services and businesses. I am your host, Carol Velandia, and I invite you to join me on a journey of discovery and empowerment. Language access is not just a matter of convenience. It is a fundamental human right and the key that unlocks doors to essential services and opportunities. In this podcast, we'll explore the far reaching impact of language access, examining how it shapes not only healthcare, justice, and education, but also the world of business. Through thought provoking interviews, insightful discussions, and compelling stories, we will unveil the power of language access. We will hear from professionals who bridge communication gaps to provide quality care for diverse communities. We will explore the intersection of language, law, and justice, and the crucial role that interpreters and translators play in ensuring fair and equitable treatment. We will delve into the challenges and innovations as well as how language access opens doors to effective communication and inclusion and how it makes our society more equitable. But our exploration doesn't stop there. We will also uncover the profound impact of language access in the world of business. We will hear from entrepreneurs, industry leaders, and experts who understand the value of inclusive and effective communication and how it drives success in today's global marketplace. Language Access Matters is your platform to understand the significance of language access in these vital sectors of society. We will shed light on the barriers faced by individuals and communities and the innovative solutions that promote inclusion and equality. Whether you are a healthcare professional, a legal expert, an educator, a business owner, a linguist, an advocate, or simply passionate about the power of language, this podcast is for you. Together, we will navigate the challenges, celebrate the victories, and advocate for a world where language access truly matters. So, join me on this enlightening journey as we uncover the impact of language access in healthcare, justice, education, and businesses. Let's amplify the voices of the 25 million people that don't speak English in the United States and those that don't speak the dominant language around the world. Those voices deserve to be heard and empowered, and we need to empower ourselves to build a more inclusive future. Welcome to Language Access Matters. Let's embark on this transformative exploration together. Today, we welcome Kevin Thakkar. He is a professional Gujarati interpreter who co-founded Americans Against Language Barriers, or AALB, in 2018, driven by a commitment to facilitate access to qualified interpreter services for free clinics. Since its inception under Kevin's leadership, AALB has transformed into an award-winning interpreter training organization dedicated to breaking down language barriers and enhancing the quality of life for individuals facing linguistic challenges. With a Master of Public Health from Emory University, specializing in health policy and management, and extensive experience as an interpreter, Kevin plays a dual role in the nonprofit organization. He not only leads the day-to-day operations, but also shares his wealth of knowledge by providing interpreting training to the students, furthering the mission to serve communities effectively. Americans Against Language Barriers, or also known as AALB, is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the health of patients with limited English proficiency by training professional medical interpreters, providing language services to healthcare institutions, and advocating for policy reform. Welcome, Kevin.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to be here.
Kevin, I have had the pleasure to work with you a few years ago, and I am honestly very impressed with what you have achieved. So I want to
talk with you about your path to today, right? So tell me a little bit about the process of founding AALB. What inspired you to establish this organization, and how was your background influenced, or how did your background influence your approach to addressing language barriers in healthcare?
Sure, yeah, and yeah, it's great to speak with you after all these years. It's like speaking with a friend, right? So I'll have this conversation is one that we can make as long or as short as we need to, but I'll try to get to the gist of it. So basically, um, the story behind AALB, where when it was founded, it was in 2018 in December. That was when we were incorporated as an organization. And the reason we were incorporated, the reason we started the organization, me and two other board members, is because when we were volunteering as undergraduate students at our university, we were pre-medical students, and we were asked to volunteer for an organization that was a medical student run free clinic in the Chicago area, and all of the medical students trained their students at this clinic, and this was in a part of Chicago that was known as Little India in Rogers Park, and so this was a free clinic that served the patients in this area, and their primary demographic was Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu, South Asian individuals, and most of them were actually limited English proficiency. So they needed interpreters, and a lot of the medical students did speak the language and were able to directly, could treat the patients. But sometimes they had medical students that didn't, of course, and so they were reaching out to the undergraduate students to see that if anyone was able to interpret. And at the time they used the word translate, and it was unclear that this was a profession. So I said that, yes, I will translate for you. I've never done anything like this. I didn't know that my Gujarati skills would be of any use in a healthcare setting. And so I was very surprised to see that. I've always been a fan of languages. And so I began to volunteer there along with a couple of my friends. And we quickly realized that when we made mistakes, no one else was able to pick up on that besides us. And so we were responsible for making sure that we were transparent with our mistakes, we were transparent with our own limitations, and essentially there was a lot of responsibility, and we did not really have the training for that. Not even touching on the language skills themselves. And so, I started researching and quickly realized that this is a profession and that we can get trained. And so I got trained and started working as an interpreter in the Chicago area. And only after I got trained, I started to realize the sheer amount of mistakes I was making without even realizing it, even with the best intentions. And I started to think about all the other people that were doing that. And these are not just vocabulary mistakes, but simply not being as accurate as I should be. With even the smaller details like tone and register and things like that. Not something that I realized that I should be doing without having professional training, and to what extent. And so I wondered, well, how many other people are in my place? And through my research, I was quickly able to see that it's basically the culture within free clinics to use ad hoc interpreters or untrained interpreters, right? Because they're volunteer run. Everyone, the doctors there are volunteering. The front desk is often volunteering, and so it's very difficult to find people to volunteer, and they're often dependent on family members and friends. And so I realized that with my peers, we realized that we needed to um, do something about it, but we didn't know exactly what. We realized that limited English people were not getting the care that they needed and access to it, and there were so many different reasons behind it, and we wanted to give them a voice to some extent. We couldn't find someone that was entirely a nonprofit organization, entirely just focused on advocating for the access to essential services for limited English people, not just in healthcare, but so many other facets too. And so we decided to start AALB, and for a couple of years, we did not know what exactly to do with it. We were in the planning phase, um, and it was during the pandemic that we realized that there were a lot of people, a lot of organizations, universities, hospitals that were posting about their need for interpreters and translators, and we realized quickly that we have an organization that can help solve this inefficiency where these organizations need interpreters and translators, but they're not able to find them, and we noticed that they were highlighting some languages in which they couldn't find interpreters and translators for, and that this was a chronic issue. And through our time, through our research and trying to understand the path to go down with AALB, we also learned that the issue with ad hoc interpreters is not just among free clinics; it's among the entire healthcare industry that is, chronically dependent on ad hoc interpreters. And so, we thought that one of the best ways to tackle this issue is going to be to develop a workforce. Uh, and so we worked to start a medical interpreter training that will train individuals that at the end of the day want to serve their community. At the end of the day, after they get this training, not only will they go and work, but they're going to go and volunteer for free clinics and really try to enhance themselves as professionals and be the best interpreter that they possibly can be. And we wanted to do this in a nonprofit structure so we could provide scholarships and targeted training for rare languages and locations in which there is a shortage of interpreters in certain languages, geographic shortage. And so that's when we started AALB in 2020. But we always kept the mission of AALB broad, and it remains to be quite broad to this day, which is to provide access to essential services for people with limited English. And one of the ways we do that is through the medical interpreter training program. And there's, it's not just healthcare. We want to focus on other fields as well: housing, education, the legal system, justice system. But with the medical interpreter training specifically, I wanted to create an organization that was not dependent on any external funding. I did not want to depend on a grant or donation. So we decided to provide a service that brought in revenue that we can reinvest.
Yes, and I remember that it was around the time of the pandemic that we actually connect. And I think it was, perhaps you remember this better than I, it was within the context of asking for volunteer interpreters that we connected somehow online. And then we kind of found that our organizations had certain similarities, except Equal Access Language Services is not a nonprofit, but it has a very similar mission, which is ending language-based discrimination. So why don't
Yeah.
you talk to me a little bit about the mission? What would you like to emphasize about the mission and vision of your organization?
Yeah, no, I mean that's one of the key things that we wanted to do was ensure that we have the ability to connect free clinics that want volunteer interpreters to them. So the interpreters are actually qualified though, because there's, and this goes back to the mission. There's a lot of people that want to volunteer that are qualified as interpreters, but simply don't know how or don't know that there's a need to volunteer. And I think the way I envision the mission is really in two different angles here, two different perspectives. One, nonprofits, they're private organizations that really do what the government should be doing if the government was able to, right? If they're able to do a wonderful job at it, but they're not because it's the government. So private organizations have to step in. That's how I see nonprofits, where we're providing a workforce training essentially, and access to essential services. Now, from a more specific perspective, though, I see the nonprofits the role as addressing inefficiencies in the market. And so one inefficiency is that these individuals, tens of millions of people, need access to essential services and simply are unable to communicate in order to get access to them. And just enabling them to communicate would solve a lot of problems that actually require money for us to spend if we don't solve it initially, if we don't just solve the communication problem in the first place. So, for example, if we are not using an interpreter for primary care services, it could lead to an exacerbation of an issue that leads to unnecessary emergency room usage that may be funded by the taxpayer at the end of the day, insurance. So, I see it as solving inefficiencies that uh, really lead to more harm in the long run if they're not solved. And I think communication barriers is just a low hanging fruit at the end of the day. You know, Go ahead.
Yes, that's so interesting because very few people understand the correlation between not between the interpreting services and actually solving inefficiencies. And in fact, they tend to look at the service as an enormous expense that they shouldn't invest in, as opposed to seeing it as, if you actually provide effective communication, you're not going to incur in the cost of medical errors and lack of patient safety. So that's another reason why I think your organization has a really successful approach to how you do to language access.
Yeah, I think that's such a big issue, because for a given individual, like let's say a provider that's running a primary care clinic, they might have an incentive to not use an interpreter, financial incentive, because they're like, well, we're not running the ER. That's not going to be directly impacting us. Just I'd be unethical, of course, but that just financially speaking. Um, so I think that does speak to the fact that um, larger entities that have greater stakes in place probably need to be focusing on ensuring that there's ubiquitous services delivered, because there are incentives for each individual to not deliver those services. Like if the insurance companies, for example, saw that on a large scale, not providing the services will result in the person that we're covering having more expenses rather than less, then they could mandate or at least require the use of interpreters, maybe reimburse them, and the use of interpreters. So I think that I almost see why, there's almost a blind eye turns for that, almost a frustration. It's seen as an expense or administrative expense, but yeah, clearly when you have the big picture, it's not right. I think that's
Yes,
quite clear.
definitely. It definitely looks like a huge expense, like a bother, and also as a very one-sided kind of access situation. It's always conceived as is the limited English proficient person who needs the access, as opposed to I, as a medical professional, need to access the communication channels to understand what my patient is feeling. So I
Yeah,
think that it's important to balance that understanding so that more professionals in the health sciences and legal sciences understand that they are part of it and they have an ethical obligation to actually access effective communication as well for the sake of their patients or clients. So,
yeah, well said, absolutely.
and tell me a little more about the actual interpreter training program. From my recollection, I remember thinking of how effective you were running it. You had a lot of almost automations set in place, even though they were not quite there yet, because I think a lot of the automations or programs that would include these automations came in later, but you had already pretty figured out. But and that's on the side of organizing such a large scale program. So tell us about the interpreting training program.
Yeah, automations is definitely one part of it. It's one way that I think that we can provide good customer service. When someone signs up, they automatically receive everything they need. They automatically get added to a spreadsheet, so we can track them well. But in terms of the training program itself, I think the key comes down to simply the instructors and the mindset behind the instructors and the team, as to the fact that we're not just training students to earn a certificate and move on. We're training them to enter a new profession, and they need to be treated like professionals that are entering a profession. And they, in the same way, our trainers have very high expectations of our students, and we have high expectations of our trainers. And I think that's really what leads to the success at the end of the day. The fact that you know it's really is the mindset. I think, and um, I think that from my perspective, I'm always very critical. I think that there's a lot of room for improvement. I don't want to see our industry staying at the 60-hour or 40-hour certificate really as being the standard or minimal entry certificate. But at the same time, we have to, as an organization, we have to balance with what the market wants. And so, um, we're looking at expanding into adding additional hours. The way we do that right now is basically we have the 60-hour certificate, and then for everyone else, who wants it, all our alumni, we just give them free training on top of that. And so the
That's
people who
awesome.
want that can be motivated to get it. But I really think that we need to raise the bar in terms of the minimum.
Yes.
And
Um, so there is a study, in fact, that talks about the difference that it makes more hours of training, because I believe the standard for interpreters is 40 hours of training. That's what we would call trained interpreters, right? And then Dr. Glenn Flores wrote about the difference that hours of training would make. So the study talks about um, the percentage of medical errors due to miscommunication if we use ad hoc interpreters, professional interpreters, and then professional interpreters that have been um, trained at the 100-hour rate. So I know you're familiar with the study. I don't know if you want to touch on that and how that influenced your decision to create your training.
Yeah, that study by Dr. Flores is, I would say, one of the primary influences that we had in the beginning, as to how we will drive the mission of AALB, like what exactly we should be doing in terms of advancing our mission while still bringing in revenue. We saw that uh, at the end of the day, training was going to be one of the most important things that we can do that will, on a large scale, improve the lives of limited English patients by reducing the mistakes of clinical significance that they face at the healthcare office. And so we wanted to increase the number of well-trained interpreters in the workforce, including languages for which there's a shortage of interpreters. And I would say that we've been doing that, but there's still quite a long way to go. And one thing that I wanted to note on that study too is that um, it showed that uh, the most mistakes are made by interpreters that um, don't have much training, right? Ad hoc interpreters that don't have any training, actually, like family members and friends. They make about over 20% error rate, if I believe correctly. And even worse, though, was actually that error rate was even higher than if no interpreter was used at all.
Exactly.
So
Yes, it was 22% of interpreter rate or error rate made by non-professional interpreter compared to 20% of error done by no interpreter.
which is that's eye opening, right? Because I'm sure that's around I'm sure that's in the standard deviation around the same error rate, but that means they're quite similar. And I think there's such a need for a larger scale study, because I don't think that there is another comparable study other than that pediatric emergency room one, and that's such a niche, um, you know, market. I think when the advent of AI and things like that, I think we can actually conduct a larger scale study that does observe this on in different specialties, see how it changes between languages. Because I think this is only Spanish interpreters, right?
Yes,
I think there's a lot to explore here, but the fact that using no interpreter at all was similar to using a family member, friend, or otherwise untrained interpreter. Uh,
right.
it, it tells you that one of the largest problems that we face in this industry are people with good intentions that want to help.
I love that. Yes. Yes, it's not only similar, but it's actually better not to have an ad hoc interpreter, not to have anybody than having a non-trained person. And then the other difference that I think is key is the difference between the number of hours from 40 to 100. The rate of error dropped from 12% made by professional interpreters that were trained at the 40-hour training mark, and then to 2% may level of errors or percentage of errors that were made by interpreters who had trained for 100 hours. So I think that what you're doing is key to dismantling that understanding of interpreting is an interpreter is just anybody, right? Anybody who speaks two languages and without even measuring how deeply they understand and speak the language. And then also dismantling the idea that experience as an interpreter is sufficient to be an interpreter, right? There are a lot of interpreters that have never been trained and that have been doing interpretation for many years and continue to make the same mistakes as always.
Yep. Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that. We've spoken to recruiters at some of the largest companies, and they agree with us when we say that people without training, like there was a applicant that had 10 years of experience but only got trained a year ago and then had another year of experience after that. They really only count that as 1 year of experience because they said you've just been doing it wrong for 10 years, right? So it's almost
And
eye-opening.
let me tell you something. As you know, I am also an interpreter trainer, and I worked for many years for a large hospital where there were many interpreters who have done interpretation for many years. And there was this particular interpreter who had been with the program, with the language access program for many, many years. He had never been trained. And he almost refused to be trained because he said, I already have all the experience in the world. I have interpreted here and there. And it was the most difficult interpreter to teach because he already had a mindset and it was so stiff he couldn't relearning was nearly impossible to him. So this is another thing that's to the detriment of the learning. Is like if you are already set on your ways and then you're not even open to the new learning, it it's going to impact your professionalism as an interpreter, and then patients are going to also suffer the consequences, and also the healthcare providers.
Absolutely, yeah. It's surprisingly common, and I suppose it's just a consequence of not having uh, regulated national standards that everyone has to adhere to. There's
Yes,
not
which
really
leads me to the next question, which is how do you see that transition in terms of policy? What do you see in the future as far as any changes?
well, I suppose it depends on how optimistic I feel that day, but I think that we're living in times that are changing quite a bit, of course, and I think the changes are coming quite quickly, and not always in terms of policy, but in terms of just environment, like with technology and artificial intelligence, of course, and sometimes policy has to react to that, as we have seen with the latest changes to the Affordable Care Act. But I think that if to talk about that one, actually, the new final rule of the Section 1557 non-discrimination provision in 2024 that was released, where they talked about AI and translation. They basically said that uh, you can use artificial intelligence to translate as long as it is proofread by a human. But this was seen as a good thing by many people. I mean, this was spun as a good thing, I should say. But from my perspective, I saw this as the death knell for the profession of translation, of at least of healthcare translation, where they essentially said that humans have to play a much smaller role now. Proofreading, and there's a little bit of ambiguity about what exactly that might mean, proofreading, and that many companies will just have people skimming through like thousands of words every few minutes, right, and call that proofreading, um, and technically they'll adhere to the national standard. So uh, I also think that it's not appropriate to use interpretation or AI translation for all languages yet, but I feel like that wasn't really addressed quite clearly in terms of policy. Uh, but just in terms of the broader picture, what I see changing is that the new Supreme Court decisions that have come through in 2024, where essentially the the executive agencies don't have as much power to pass regulations. They have to adhere to what the judicial system says. I see that as being potentially significant, because right now the mandate to provide qualified interpreters and translators is a regulation on the statute of the Affordable Care Act. So it's actually created through regulatory authority of the HHS secretary, and they basically created the law, and they were the ones to decide, the HHS, that qualified interpreters and qualified translators need to be used. They said this is how Title VI applies to healthcare. So the HHS, they created Section 1557, the regulation that says that we have to provide, our healthcare covered entities have to provide qualified interpreters and qualified translators. So there's two things that could happen here. The HHS can change their mind. They can say that there's no longer a mandate, right? They're the ones that created that regulation. They can take it away. It does not take an act of Congress to do that, as many people have the misconception of, because this was created through the regulatory authority in the first place. Next, the what could happen also is that the courts could say that this is an overreach of Title VI. At the end of the day, that Section 1557 is overreaching the mandate in Title VI to prevent discrimination against national origin, because now it's turning a negative right into a positive right. It's saying that we need to provide something rather than not do something. And so the courts could argue that, and I think that potentially could be something that some sides could see as a valid argument. And this is more me just when I'm being pessimistic, I suppose. Uh, all of this is founded, all of this language access stuff, it's founded on the premise from the 1974 Supreme Court decision that national origin and language are tied together. And that's judicial precedent that can be changed by another Supreme Court case. And so if they say that, no, language and national origin, this is not what was intended by Title VI and the Civil Rights Act, that national origin truly simply meant the country that you came from, and it was not meant, having language tied to that is an overreach. That could be a potential perspective. And so these are changes that I'm not saying are necessarily coming, but are technically possible, and that we as an industry, we as a community, we should be prepared for.
Yes, it could happen. And there is a lot. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's all.
Were you going to say something?
That's all.
No, I think there is a lot to unpack there. And let me just recap on something that you said about the artificial intelligence and the translation. I think it is important to mention there is an initiative that's called Safe AI, and they have already written some really key recommendations on how to use AI, because it is clear that AI is going to be used. Right. The thing is how to use it, and also who is going to bear the responsibility of AI translated material. So definitely the humans in the loop approach is going to continue. Now, hopefully we don't get to the point where all of the concepts that we have, such as, for example, you mentioned the standard for qualified interpreters. Hopefully that doesn't get overturned, but I hope it also gets clearly defined, because I think to this point is not defined. I mean, we know that the standard is sort of like 40 hours of training, but I don't think everybody understands it that way. And the other thing, so I am hoping that there is a better definition, and I'm certainly hoping that things don't get over, or laws don't get overturned, or concepts don't get overturned to the detriment of the limited English proficient population. But I am also hoping that professionals like doctors, nurses, anybody in the healthcare industry, and anybody in the justice um, environment and educational environment realizes that they have to take a stance on language access, because um, they have a professional obligation, they have an ethical obligation to have effective communication, and also contribute to, or vote for different policy changes. So we have to do a lot of work, in other words, to raise awareness of the professionals that need to know, or that need to uphold ethical standards. And we also need to raise awareness among the community of limited English proficient persons. However, that's a lot more difficult because there is not a unified identity among them. So, yeah. So I don't know what your thoughts are on how to approach that from the perspective of organizations like yours, and equal access, how to advocate under the current political circumstances. And probably this is a question that's beyond our scope, but if you have something to add,
Yeah,
that would be.
I think that there's two angles, and AALB at the end of the day, I do see us as a advocacy organization that wants to influence policy, but to favor people with limited English, to favor people who are deaf and hard of hearing, that have language barriers in general, and I think we need to approach that in two different ways. At the end of the day, the the non-discrimination provision is not just about people with limited English. It's about non-discrimination for all sorts of categories. I think we need to learn from the deaf community, and we need to have a limited English act of some type to protect limited English people in the United States on a federal level. And I think it also needs to happen on a state by state level, because at the end of the day, when something is not in the Constitution, it's technically the jurisdiction of the states, and so the states should exercise that right. States that want to protect limited English people, they should pass laws and uh, essentially protect them from being harmed at the end of the day. That's really what we see as the most important thing: harm prevention. Um, and I think that federal is going to be an uphill battle that's always going to be in the spotlight, always trying to be changed by various parties. But in certain states, I think that there's an environment that would be favorable. But I always hesitate to involve the government in anything, right? I always feel like one step in the right direction, you never know, there might be unintended consequences that may result in two steps in the wrong. Measure three times and cut once is how I think of it.
But I see eye to eye with you on the concept that the non-discrimination provision is what unifies the deaf and hard of hearing community and the limited English proficient population as well, and that we certainly need to unite forces because, in my opinion, they are way ahead of us. I mean, the deaf and hard of hearing community have done a lot of advocacy, have been able to produce an actual law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there is a lot to learn from there because there is this aspect that we need to focus on, and it's like discrimination is discrimination, whether you are discriminated because of the nationality you have, or because you have a physical impairment, and that's how we need to approach it, in my opinion, in order to level the playing field. Now, this might be controversial, but I think we need to have a conversation around it. So we see eye to eye, and perhaps there are a lot of things that we can do in that type of or in that direction for advocacy purposes. Now, if we can talk a little bit about the precisely that, how are you planning any collaborations and partnerships? How does AALB collaborate with other organizations or government agencies to enhance language access services nationwide?
So one thing that we are working on is we want to have a database of qualified interpreters that want to volunteer their time for charitable organizations that are providing essential services. So we're going to be starting with free clinics. So just how talking about how I started as an interpreter. There's a lot of free clinics in the United States that still depend on ad hoc interpreters, and really most of them don't have an obligation, technically, legally speaking, to provide a qualified interpreter because they don't get federal funding, but they still want to because they're mission driven. They want to provide the best care for their patient, and so. But a lot of them may not know that qualified interpreters will help them provide better services. So basically, one thing that we're doing is that we've partnered with the Virginia Association of Free and Charitable Clinics, and we're piloting some of our um, interpreters to go and volunteer for them to the clinics under them that are members of that organization. And we've been doing this in Virginia, and we've been doing this in Illinois. And I've been very careful to only do this with a small number of clinics because I want to make sure that we're able to scale this on a national scale. And we need the logistical support on our end to be able to do that. And we're still growing as an organization. We're still, a relatively small team of, 3 full-time individuals and lots of different contractors as trainers, and so I feel as though I don't want to grow too quickly and then not be able to uh, connect all of the clinics to the volunteers they need. And so I am trying to depend on automations and things like that to allow us to scale. I think that's really the partnership project that we're focused most on. And other than that, we partner with organizations all the time to train interpreters for them, whether it be community colleges or universities, hospitals that want to provide continuing education to their staff interpreters or introductory training to their actual employees that are bilingual and get them qualified to become interpreters. Saves them quite a bit of money. So those are the things we've been doing. We work with some disability advocacy organizations to to train people that are blind. That I think that being an interpreter is a great job for people who are blind. That's a high skill job that they can easily work from home. And that's we found that that's a very fulfilling job for a lot of individuals. So we've been giving scholarships to some blind individuals and people with low vision. And one
That's
project,
awesome.
Yeah, it's
Congratulations!
fun.
I didn't know that. I know
Uh,
that we've been teaching deaf and hard of hearing. No, I'm sorry, that we're teaching deaf interpreters or ASL interpreters. Correct me if I'm wrong.
that's right.
In the training, so I love this concept as well.
Yeah, we're working on our. We used to have a training program not too long ago that was entirely in sign language, led by deaf individuals, and we gave scholarships for qualified deaf interpreters and some certified deaf interpreters as well to uh, take the training with us. But we're revamping the program right now. I'm not an American language sign language signer, so it was hard for me to monitor the quality of that training. And so I've put together, assembled a new team, and we're revamping the curriculum a little bit. And it was well received, but I want to make sure that it's as high of quality it could possibly be. And yeah, we're planning on launching that likely in the late spring, early summer. We're gonna do that's gonna be our third round of that, and no spoken language is allowed. So I go and observe it, but I honestly need an interpreter whenever I go and observe. I have no idea what's going on. So it's
Okay,
fun.
of course, it's good to be in the flip side of things, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Kevin, I would like to ask you about one future goal that you have, and there was one in particular that we discussed at some point previously, which caught my attention. I would like for you to speak briefly on this goal of yours about the establishing a watchdog program to hold covered entities accountable for systematic discriminatory practices. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh man, I actually am very excited about this. I don't remember when did I tell you about this. Was it recently?
Some time ago, yes.
Okay. So this is the idea. I've actually been making a little bit of progress on this quite recently, and so the idea is that obviously we know that there's a culture of discrimination that occurs in for that violations of Title VI, violations of Section 1557, and so forth. But it's hard to catch these with healthcare. This is happening in the appointment. Okay, it's we can't go in patients' appointments and observe it. So I was trying to think, how can we catch these? How can we watch organizations essentially hold them accountable, whether it be the government or whether it be private organizations? How can we hold them accountable for the laws that they should be following? And um, we want to do this on a large scale. And I've been trying to figure out how we should start this. And this is what we're going to be planning. I'm in the planning stages right now. We are going to be having individuals that we train on basic civil rights law, and we're going to be having them go and observe courtrooms that are open to the public. And they're going to be documenting what they see when they see limited English individuals that don't get a interpreter. Then they're going to document that. And if there's a pattern of that happening in a given courtroom and with a given judge, that'll be reported to us as the advisory board, and then we'll decide whether or not to report that to the Department of Justice as an organization. And so I think that's going to be the main way we start because that's very easily accessible to us. And I only decided to go that way because I got a traffic ticket and it was like within me of being there for 30 minutes, they already failed to use interpreters twice. They were using a, a daughter as an interpreter one time for a mother, and the second time they were just trying to speak to them, just very slowly. And these are both Spanish-speaking individuals. And I went to the uh, court interpreter room. They had interpreters there, and I asked them why wasn't an interpreter used? And it is regular procedure to use an interpreter, so they were surprised as well, but they didn't seem to care that much, to be honest.
Let
So
me tell you. Sorry,
go ahead.
what were you going to say?
No, that's all. I think this. I think in low level offenses, this is something that's almost ignored from my anecdotal experience. When
Yes,
I
that's my court interpreting experience is a lot of people get to the court for their own cases, and so at some point along the proceeding, or whether when they were Mirandized or somewhere in the process of getting arrested or then interrogated, interpretation failed, or a cop that spoke Spanish or some Spanish did the interrogation or helped with the translation, the interpretation. Sorry. So, do you see that? Are you familiar with lep.gov?
Yeah,
Do you see that this as a supplemental kind of effort, or are you going to, or is your vision that you are going to go through lep.gov for that, or are you using that tool at all?
are you referring to when we for reporting individuals or?
for reporting instances where organizations are not complying.
Right. So we would work with the government agencies where appropriate. So like trying to report directly to the Department of Justice, but I want to make sure we're also not wasting their time.
Ah,
Sometimes with like one-off incidents where it's just an incidental case where an interpreter is not used, that might not be worth their time. I want to really make sure that we help them focus on systematic issues. And sometimes these are not being systematic issues are not really seen other than by people who are sitting there every day observing. A one-off case might get reported to the Department of Justice directly. We're not too interested in that in the one-off cases right now, unless there is evidence of harm happening. Then, of course, we would want them to help them get some representation there. But if it's just cases where we see a pattern, then we would work with the government to what extent is necessary. But honestly, we're still in the planning phase
the
of it.
planning
So I
stages.
don't
Okay.
exactly know the exact procedures we'll be using, all the resources we'll be using in order to make sure that uh, we're doing everything effectively. Because one thing that I don't want is wasting anyone's time, and also using our resources ineffectively. Um,
Awesome. Yes, and I think that all that effort and that commitment is really important to underscore. And this is why I'm so pleased that you are a guest in our podcast and that we are um, starting the year with someone like you who is very committed to improving language access across the board. And with that, I would like to ask you, what would be the call to action? What steps can healthcare providers and policymakers take to support organizations like AALB and improve language access for patients with limited English proficiency and deaf and hard of hearing?
I really think that the best thing that well, it depends on who we're talking to here. In terms of policymakers and Congress individuals, I think that they need to listen to their constituents, of course, and see what exactly their needs are at the end of the day. And I think they'll find that limited English individuals, if they make up a large percentage of their constituency, they're going to find that they lack access to essential services. They at least simple access to high quality essential services. They have to navigate quite a bit. And so I really think that the number one thing that we can do is make it much easier for limited English people to access services by making it easier for them to get access to interpreters and translators. And either that or simply uh, looking into why we have laws that are on the books but are not being enforced. So if policymakers are in a position to enforce laws that are on the books, that should be, I think, a focus because there is a culture of non-discrimination, and it's not because we don't have the laws on the books. It's simply because they're not being
Mm-hmm.
enforced, and part of that goes back to the enforcement mechanisms in place. But that's a longer story. Um, if we were speaking to individuals, though, just private individuals, I would say don't volunteer as an interpreter unless you're actually able to be qualified as an interpreter, unless you're actually able to interpret. Even though one has good intentions, always ask for a qualified interpreter for family members and friends and see if there's a reasonable effort being made and hold the provider, hold the healthcare system, hold them accountable to actually making that effort. Um,
Yeah, and I think that's it's several vertices of where to approach this call to action, right? One is the professionals that have to communicate with limited English proficient people. One is the policymakers, and as you said, the limited English proficient person, which I know is a lot more challenging to reach out to them in their own language. But there are efforts, and in fact, offline, I'll talk to you about some of the efforts that are available. But we need to also inform them that they have a right to effective communication, right? So I think it's wonderful what you're doing, Kevin. Thank you so much for coming and telling us about it. And any other remarks that you want to do in closing before we say goodbye?
I think it's great. I am optimistic about the future, and nevertheless, thinking we need to prepare for the worst case scenarios. I think year by year, it is getting better for limited English people, and we are called Americans against language barriers because I think caring for limited English people is one of the values that we have as Americans, and I think it is really a distinctive value. And so that's all. I think that we should keep being Americans and keep being inclusive to people that may not speak English. So that's great, and I'm happy to come back in the future. I'm sure we could talk for hours and hours about other topics too, right?
I'm sure we could talk for hours and hours. There are
Yep.
so many things that we have in common, our organizations have in common, and I look forward to having you again. Thank
Absolutely.
you very much, Kevin. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that wraps up another enlightening episode of Language Access Matters. We hope you have enjoyed our discussion on the profound impact language access has across various sectors of society. Let's remember that language access is not just an isolated topic. It intertwines with various fields, impacting lives and businesses in profound ways. As we continue this journey together into becoming a more inclusive society where we ensure equal access to services to those who don't speak the dominant language, we want to assure you that our company, Equal Access Language Services, through its podcast Language Access Matters, will be with you every step of the way. We are committed to bringing you thought-provoking conversations, expert opinions, and stories from the field and beyond. To dive deep into the subject matter and engage with leading experts in the field, we will release a new episode of Language Access Matters once a month. By featuring expert practitioners and individuals with diverse experiences, we aim to broaden the scope of our discussions and present a comprehensive view of the importance of language access. We encourage you to stay connected with us through our website, www.equalaccesslanguageservices.com, and our social media platforms. You can join the conversation, ask questions, and share your own stories and experiences. If you want to be part of our podcast, email us to podcast@equalaccesslanguageservices.com. Remember, language access matters to each and every one of us. By understanding its significance and actively working towards its advancement, we can create a more inclusive and equitable society. Thank you for being a part of the Language Access Matters community. We appreciate your support and look forward to sharing more knowledge, inspiration, and empowerment with you in our future episodes.